Boa tarde a todos que estão presentes para iniciar mais uma sessão da Abralim ao vivo. Eu sou Maria Cristina, faço parte da diretoria da Abralim do biênio 2022-2024 e hoje a gente vai ter o prazer de ver a professora doutora Sónia Frota, da Universidade de Lisboa. Eu passo a palavra para a professora Mônica Molnar, que vai fazer a apresentação da professora Frota.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Monica Molnar and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in Canada. And I'm glad to be here today to moderate today's talk organized by Bilingual Vivo, Linguists Online, which is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's wonderful speaker, Dr. Sónia Frota. Dr. Frota is a professor of experimental linguistics, director of the Lisbon Baby Lab, and scientific coordinator of the Center of Linguistics of the University of Lisbon. Her research and publications focus on prosody in language and on early speech perception and language development in typical and atypical populations. She has recently directed 2 language acquisition projects with clinical applications, early language development in Down syndrome, and predictors of language outcomes. With her colleagues at the Lisbon Baby Lab, she has developed a number of resources and tools for screening early language development problems, including the acquisition of prosody. Thank you, Dr. Frota, for being here today. And before I hand over the virtual microphone to you, I just would like to remind the audience that they can post their questions into the chat. And Dr. Frota, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Cristina and Mônica. Olá a todos, boa tarde, bom dia, boa noite. Hi everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here and be part of Abralim ao vivo. I will now start my presentation, so I will share my screen with you. Okay, so I hope you can all see my screen now. And my presentation is titled Early Word Segmentation and Word Learning, Prosody, Phonotactics, and Face Masks. There is by now a vast literature on infants' early sensitivity to the prosodic properties of speech, which possibly relies on a universal biological mechanism rooted in the general properties of the mammalian auditory system. This early sensitivity is unsurprising, as speech prosody is the first experience we have with language. This early sensitivity is the foundation for prosodic bootstrapping, as prosodic cues may help with language learning, as in the case of the critical word segmentation ability, which is a prerequisite for word learning. Early sensitivity is generally thought to be independent of the native language. However, early development of prosody is also shaped by the ambient language, and this has been underscored in recent research. Although the functions of prosody are quite general across languages, we know that prosodic cues are language specific. For example, languages cue stress in different ways using different properties. The same happens to prosodic boundaries, to the distinctions between sentence types, as in the case of questions versus statements, for example, or to the expression of focus. Crucially, language vary as to which prosodic cues are relevant and informative. This raises a fundamental question. If early prosodic perception is guided by the native language, which prosodic patterns or cues are attended to in any given language and have thus the potential of scaffolding language learning? Well, the answer to this question requires a large empirical research endeavor. An added challenge concerns the comparison between typically developing and atypically developing infants, which have varied language experiences. And it is largely unknown whether early prosodic development differs between these two populations. Every language is important for this research endeavor. In addition, some languages might be of particular typological interest, and I believe that is the case of European Portuguese. Because European Portuguese does not follow the general Romance language prosodic profile or the general Germanic languages prosodic profile with respect to the properties for stress, with respect to rhythmic patterns, and also the ways prosodic structure and intonation structure are implemented. Brazilian Portuguese, for example, is much closer to the typical Romance language prosodic profile than European Portuguese is. In this talk, I address the fundamental question of which prosodic patterns and cues are attended to in early prosodic development through a series of speech perception experiments using eye-gaze paradigms and focusing on the prosodic dimensions of stress and intonation and the role of prosody in the development of early word segmentation abilities in the first year of life. Then I proceed to link these questions to the development of word learning abilities in the second year of life and also later vocabulary development. I will do so looking at three groups of European Portuguese learning infants and toddlers. The typically developing group, the TD group, these are the infants and toddlers with no known risk for language impairments. The infants and toddlers at risk for language impairments, the AR group, and the infants and toddlers with Down syndrome, the DS group. The at-risk group includes a number of risk factors, such as familiar risk for autism spectrum disorder or language disorder, premature birth, low birth weight, and other risk factors like low APGAR score at birth and global developmental delay. The infants and toddlers with Down syndrome have a genetic perturbation known as trisomy 21, and this is the most common genetic cause of intellectual disability. It is known to affect language development and language processing, although there are very few studies with infants. And in addition, I will also examine the impact of the COVID-19 related changes on early word segmentation abilities and later vocabulary development. So this is the plan for the talk. I will start with early stress perception and early perception of intonation, then move to early word segmentation and the role of prosody in the development of this ability, and then talk about word learning in connection to the previous topics, and finally look at word segmentation and later vocabulary outcomes in the particular context of COVID-19. And finally, I will conclude with a discussion of the main findings. So starting with word stress. We all know that word stress is a prosodic dimension that varies across languages in two crucial domains. So it varies with respect to phonological grammar, because we may have languages that have variable, non-predictable stress, like English or Portuguese, language with fixed stress, like Finnish or Turkish, or language with no stress, like French and Korean. Also, we know that the phonetics of stress varies across languages, as language may choose different acoustic properties as the main correlates of stress. Importantly, word stress seems to be a powerful bootstrapping tool, as infants may utilize stress to segment the speech signal, to categorize words, and also to learn word meanings, and this in turn facilitates word learning and syntactic processing. In this talk, I will focus on the segmentation of the speech signal and word learning. I will now present a first study that we conducted at the lab together with Joe Butler, Ertugrul Wissal, Katia Severino, and Marina Vigario, a study on early stress perception in a language that does not offer the usual clear set of cues for stress that is typically based on the rhythmic profile. So what would be a clear rhythmic profile would be a stress-based language like English or German, or a syllable-based language like Spanish or Catalan. European Portuguese is neither. And the other usual the other usual cue for stress in this set of cues is the frequency of the dominant stress pattern. And in the case of European Portuguese, the frequency of stress patterns also does not point in a straightforward way to a clear dominant pattern. So we ask how stress discrimination develops in a language with such conflicting cues for stress, and which cues will infant attend to. So we had 24 typical developing infants participating in the study with a mean age of 5 months. And we used as materials disyllabic, segmentally varied pseudo words with stress either in the initial syllable, this is a trochaic pattern, or stress in the final syllable, this is the iambic pattern. And let me play you an example.
Namu, namu.
Okay, so as you can see, the main cues are the longer duration of the stressed syllable compared to the unstressed syllable, and also the location of the pitch fall in the stressed syllable. So the pitch range is completely different between the stressed syllable and the unstressed syllable. We used an adaptation of the anticipatory eye movement paradigm implemented with eye tracking. So we had a training phase where one stress pattern is associated with one image and side of the screen. And then we have test phase where we present trials with no visual stimulus, only the auditory stimulus. And in these test trials, we have novel non-words with either one of the stress patterns. It's easier to follow it, showing an example of an experimental block.
Namu, diku.
So the training.
Supu, kiru. Supu, namu, kiru, diku.
And now the test.
Bitu, juku, milu, tanu. Bitu, juku, milu, tanu.
Okay. So discrimination will be signaled in this paradigm by longer looking time to the train side, and a preference for one of the stress patterns would be signaled by longer looking time to one of the train sides, regardless of the test stimuli heard. And what did we find? We found an interaction between side and stimuli, showing that there was one train side that was preferred over the other, irrespective of the test trials that were being heard. So infants' looking behavior was asymmetrical with a preference for the iambic stress pattern. So this provides the first evidence of asymmetrical perception at such an early age, and shows that early stress perception is guided by prosodic cues, namely the prosodic cue of duration, together with and in combination with the computation of the frequency patterns of stress in the language that goes beyond the lexical words. So to get a dominance of iambic stress, we need to take into account connected speech in European Portuguese. So we need to go beyond the lexical words. Okay, so the next study asks, what about atypical development? So do atypical development infants show the same kind of early stress discrimination ability with regard to stress? So this is a study in progress, and we have as participants a group of infants at risk for language development with a mean age of 5 months, and a group of infants with Down syndrome with a mean age of 6 months. And we found a group effect with the at-risk infants showing overall a longer looking time, but we found no evidence for a distinction between the iambic and trochaic patterns. So the at-risk group and the Down syndrome group, they show no stress discrimination or preference, unlike what was found for the TD infants. Of course, this raises a question about the possible use of stress as a bootstrapping tool by atypically developing infants. Okay, so now we want to know how early perception of intonation develops. We all know that speech encodes linguistic information, and the functions of speech vary across languages. And also the cues, the pitch cues that are used to signal meanings, so they also vary. For example, pitch signals lexical meanings in tone and pitch accent languages, whereas in the so-called intonation languages, it typically signals phrasal sentential meanings like sentence type distinctions or other pragmatic distinctions. And we know that pitch is a possible cue for word segmentation. So in this talk, I will present a series of experiments looking at the distinction, the pitch-based distinction between statements and yes-no questions in European Portuguese. So the question that we ask is the following: does early perception of pitch support precocious discrimination abilities for pitch contrasts in the presence of segmental variability in the same way as we found for stress in the case of typically developing infants? So we did a series of discrimination studies. I will report the findings from 2 of these studies that look at the native perception of the statement yes, no question distinction by TD infants and by AR and DS infants. And I will also summarize some findings on infants' non-native perception of the same prosodic distinction. We used, in all studies, we used as materials segmentally varied single pseudo-word utterances. The pseudo words were all bisyllabic sequences with initial stress. And the critical cue for the distinction, as you may see from the examples here, has to do with the final pitch difference in pitch height and direction. And let me play you examples of the stimuli. First, the statements.
Mola, Milo, Rina, Lamo.
And the questions.
Luma, Lamo, Norro, Rina.
Okay. So we used the modified version of the visual habituation paradigm, with infants habituated with lists of stimuli for a given pitch pattern. And then in the test phase, infants were presented with lists of different stimuli in both types of patterns. So the same type as in the habituation and the different kind of stimuli from the habituation. Looking times to the visual display were recorded and compared, and in this paradigm, if infants are sensitive to the prosodic contrast, they should display longer listening times to the novel, the different trials. 40 typical developing infants participated in the first study that was conducted together with Joe Butler and Marina Vigario. And they were split into age groups, a younger group and an older age group. And we found that for both age groups, there was a longer listening time to the novel test trials, showing that infants are able to discriminate utterances that differ only in the prosodic features that cue segmentations and questions as early as 5 months of age in the presence of segmental variability. Again, in the following study, we asked how was intonation perception in atypically developing groups. And again, we studied a group of infants at risk for language development with a mean age of 6 months, and infants with Down syndrome, infants at risk for language impairment, and a group of infants with Down syndrome with a mean age of 8 months. We found no effect of group and a strong effect of trial type. Crucially, the at-risk and Down syndrome groups did not differ from the TD group, showing that these groups have early discrimination abilities for the native intonation contrast that are similar to those that were found in the typically developing infants. So a result that is quite different from the one that we found for stress perception. Let me very quickly summarize findings from other collaborative work where we started to investigate whether infants learning other languages with different sets of cues for the statement yes, no question contrasts were also sensitive to the European Portuguese prosodic patterns. And we found that infants were behaving as native listeners already by 4 or 5 months of age because their perception was dependent on the cues offered by their native language. So discrimination of the following rising intonation contrast was found to be language dependent, and crucially, the TD, AR, and DS groups show the same discrimination abilities of the native contrast. And this is a striking finding, as the ability to attend to a given set of cues may have implications for the acquisition of linguistic categories that are cued by prosody. And thus, intonation perception may be a strength also in atypical language acquisition and can perhaps be possibly used as a bootstrapping tool. Okay, so now we'll try to connect the results from perception with word segmentation and the role of prosody in word segmentation. So we all know that word segmentation is the ability to identify individual words from continuous speech. And this ability plays a crucial role in language acquisition, namely as a precursor to word learning. In typically developing infants, the development of segmentation abilities has been shown to vary across languages. Prosody has also been suggested to facilitate segmentation. We are interested here, given the singular prosodic profile of European Portuguese, we are interested to know which prosodic cues European Portuguese learning infants might be using to develop early segmentation abilities. As to atypical development, to the best of our knowledge, there are only a few studies on segmentation abilities in atypical development, and they have reported that the development of these abilities is seriously delayed, but the learning path seems to be similar to that shown by TD infants and toddlers. Also, there are 2 studies on segmentation abilities in infants at risk for language impairments, namely preterm infants, and the 2 studies reported mixed findings. In one case, infants succeed, in another case, infants fail. The segmentation abilities in atypical development as we can see from previous literature, have only started to be examined, and the role of prosody has not yet been explored in the case of atypical development. And indeed, the role of prosody and prosodic structure has not been much investigated also in the case of typical development. Our segmentation studies examined whether prosody facilitated word segmentation, and I will report results from two studies: the original study with typical developing infants, and then another study with infants at risk for language impairment and infants and toddlers with Down syndrome. The materials for both studies are based on the original study developed together with Joe Butler, and I will refer to it as the BNF study. So we used 4 monosyllabic pseudo-words of the CVC or CV glide type and constructed 2 passages for each word, one for the medial prosodic position and one for the edge prosodic position. So the medial position is internal to the intonational phrase and is a much less prominent position than the edge position, which is final to the intonational phrase. And this prosodically prominent position is cued by the pitch range of the final fall of the nuclear pitch accent of the utterance, and also by the phrase final lengthening that we find at the edge position. And of course, both these differences were significant in our stimuli. We used a modified version of the visual habituation paradigm. Infants were familiarized with passages containing 2 other pseudo-words, and then they were tested with isolated, familiar, and novel word forms. And in this paradigm, segmentation is usually demonstrated by longer looking times to familiar word forms when compared to the novel word forms. And here we can see an example of one of the familiarization passages in the medial prosodic condition, followed by 2 test trials. Let me try to play it. Yes.
A Marta pôs o seu fundo na mesa. Fizemos festas ao fundo vermelho. Nunca comi fumo com morangos. O Todd desenhou um fumo bonito. Conheço o fumo doce do Algarve. Eles disseram fumo muitas vezes. Pis, 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 pis.
The test trial, the first one, and the second.
Full, 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 full.
Okay, so we had 40 typically developing infants participating in the study with an age range between 4 and 10 months. And we found a clear effect of the prosodic condition. Specifically, there was early segmentation right from 4 months of age for the prosodic edge position, and segmentation at the prosodic medial position was still developing by 10 months of age. So we could conclude that prosody indeed facilitated segmentation, and early word segmentation is guided by prosodic structure edge cues. So we can see now the relevance of the prosodic edge in a new language particular combination of prosodic cues, so the one that European Portuguese displays. Next, of course, we wanted to know if similar mechanisms and or trajectories are guiding word segmentation in atypical development. So, of course, we wanted to know if a similar pattern of results was obtained, perhaps possibly with some delays. So we studied atypically developing groups. and a group of 21 infants and toddlers at risk for language impairment participate in the study, together with a group of 25 infants and toddlers with Down syndrome. First, the results for the at-risk group. We found a significant effect of prosodic condition, and the effect was clearly driven by the prosodic edge, because there was clear evidence for segmentation in edge position. There was no effect of age, because we found exactly the same pattern of results across age groups. In the case of the Down syndrome group, unlike for the at-risk group, the Down syndrome group was not segmenting in none of the prosodic conditions, and again, age had no influence on the pattern of findings. A cross-group analysis clearly showed that the DS group, the Down syndrome group, is different from the two other groups, having a shorter looking time to the edge condition, a longer looking time to the medial prosodic condition, and showing no segmentation at the prosodic edge. The at-risk group and the TD group show a similar pattern of results, but in the case of the at-risk group, the segmentation in medial position is delayed. So we can say that infants and toddlers with Down syndrome follow a different developmental path with regard to the use of prosody in early word segmentation, whereas the at-risk babies successfully segmented at the prosodic edge. But although they follow the same developmental path as typical developing infants, there was no segmentation in medial position yet, showing that segmentation abilities are delayed in the at-risk group. So, summing up so far, we have found that perception abilities for prosody are different in the three groups of infants and toddlers, and here emerging abilities are signaled in green. So we have seen that stress is a weakness for the atypically developing groups, whereas intonation is a strength for all groups of children examined. So we may ask, what about the use of stress as a potential bootstrapping tool? Can stress be used as a potential bootstrapping tool both in typically developing infants and in atypically developing infants? The answer seems to be yes for typical development and no for atypical development. Indeed, we found a correlation between the performance of TD infants in the stress perception experiment and their ability to segment word forms at the prosodic edge. And we found no such relation between at-risk infants, no such relation between stress abilities, stress perception abilities and segmentation abilities in at-risk infants. And intonation. Can intonation be used as a potential bootstrapping tool? The answer seems to be yes, both for typical and atypical development. And as intonation is a strength also in atypical development, this suggests that it might be used as a bootstrapping tool, both in the case of TD infants and at-risk infants that also succeed in edge segmentation. I will now move to word learning and look at a study on early word learning that we developed together with Jovana Pejovic, Katia Severino, and Marina Vigario. Okay, so We know that developing a lexicon is a very complex process and requires a number of skills, starting perhaps with the segmentation skill and also the skill of associating sound sequences to meaning. A number of studies have asked the question of how does the knowledge about the sounds, so the speech perception abilities, interact with the knowledge about the words in early word learning. Previous work has shown that early word learning is sensitive to native phonotactic patterns and regularities, with high-frequency sequences being learned earlier. Moreover, we know that word learning is possible with non-native phonological sequences, but not with phonologically illegal sequences. And we know that similar sounding word pairs are especially challenging for the early learner. And the beginnings of sound meaning associations have been suggested not only to correlate with later language outcomes, but also to signal risk for language impairments. So in our study, we examined whether and how relative phonotactic frequency, specifically high and low probability sound sequences and phonological grammar, in the case of illegal sound sequences, impacted word learning in both typically developing and infants at risk for language impairment. We used similar sounding pairs in an eye gaze task. Furthermore, we looked at the relation between performance in the word learning task and language outcomes measured by the European Portuguese CDI short forms. We had two groups in this study, so the typically developing group with 31 toddlers and the at-risk group with 29 toddlers, so the mean age was 20 months. The speech stimuli were disyllabic sequences that were embedded in natural sentences. We had high-frequency sound sequences and low-frequency sound sequences, together with illegal sound sequences. The visual stimuli were taken from a previous study, Gonzalez Gomez et al. 2013. And we also had a set of control items that consisted of familiar words for familiar objects. So this is the design of one experimental block. So each experimental block consisted of a learning phase, a test phase, and a control trial. There were three kinds of learning conditions. Learning with a high-frequency pseudo word, learning with a low-frequency pseudo word, and learning with an illegal sequence non-word. In the learning phase, there was one object that was labeled 6 times. This is the familiar sound object pair. And there is one object that is never labeled in the learning phase. And in the test phase, we have the familiar label, familiar object sound pair, and we have the unfamiliar label, so the unfamiliar object sound pair. And of course, in the end, we have the control presenting one familiar word. And let me play you an example.
Olá! Vamos dar um nome a este boneco.
So the learning phase.
Este é o Sato. Olha para o Sato. Vamos brincar com o Sato. Sato! Olha para ele. Sato é bonito. Eu tenho outro boneco.
Now the object that is not
Também
labeled.
podes brincar com ele. Eu gosto muito do Sato. Olha! Onde está o Nhago?
The test phase.
Olha! Olha para o Sato. Olha! Olha para a sopa.
And the control. Okay, what were the results? for the TD, we found an interaction between familiarity and the learning condition. And specifically, we found that the difference between the familiar and the unfamiliar sound object pair was only found in the high frequency learning condition. So the TD infants are learning the word, but only in the high frequency learning condition. For the at-risk, there were no significant differences. And so we concluded that the at-risk infants, the at-risk toddlers, are not learning in any of the conditions. Next, we examine the relation between the performance in the word learning task and the concurrent and later vocabulary outcomes of the two groups of toddlers. For the TD, the proportion of looking time to the target in the high frequency learning condition correlated positively with the concurrent CDI score. And this relation was not found for the at-risk group. However, for the at-risk group, we found that the overall proportion of looking time to the target correlated with later vocabulary outcomes, both at 24 months of age and at 30 months of age. So we may say that word learning depends on the learning condition, suggesting that phonotactic frequency guides toddlers' early knowledge of the phonological grammar of words. And the absence of a similar effect in the at-risk group might suggest either phonological delay or a different developmental path. Nevertheless, there was a strong link between performance of the at-risk group at word learning task and the development, the later development of expressive vocabulary. So, summing up so far, previously we saw that stress in typically developing infants and intonation, both in typically developing and at-risk infants, facilitated word segmentation. Word segmentation has been suggested to be a precursor to word learning, and indeed, we saw that the TD infants succeeded overall in the word segmentation task and also succeeded in the word learning task in the high frequency learning condition. The at-risk group only succeeded partially in the word segmentation task and did not succeed in the word learning task. But still, their performance in word segmentation at prosodic age correlated positively with their performance in the word learning task, showing a link between the use of prosody in word segmentation and the word learning ability. Okay, so we are now in the last point of the talk, and let's go back to word segmentation. And this time, let's go back to word segmentation in a special context, the COVID-19 pandemic context. Previous research indicates that speech perception is inherently multisensory, and infants integrate auditory and visual cues quite early in development. With COVID-19, there was a generalized use of face masks in many countries, and visual speech information became occluded. Also, face masks degrade the acoustic signal. So it's not just visual speech cues, it's also auditory speech cues that are affected. And these changes in the cues available for language have been shown to affect speech processing, such as in the case of voice recognition and word recognition. Alongside mask use, COVID led to other changes in everyday communication and interaction that have been shown to have potential effects on language development and cognitive development. So we ran 2 word segmentation tasks, one auditory experiment and one audiovisual experiment, based on the previous BNF study and using the same materials as in the BNF study and similar procedures, with the addition, of course, of the mask condition. The participants were 7 to 9-month-old infants that were born during the pandemic. So the results are summarized here in this slide, and we can see that we found no evidence for segmentation, not even at edge position and regardless of the mask condition. This was quite surprising, as we were expecting, of course, on the basis of the previous word segmentation studies, we were expecting 7 to 9-month-olds to show segmentation abilities at the prosodic edge. We compared the segmentation data from the COVID-19 study with segmentation data from the BNF pre-pandemic study, and found that the mean looking time for prosodic edge was significantly higher than the unfamiliar condition in the BNF study only. So this confirms that there is no word segmentation at the prosodic edge in the COVID-19 study. We also compared other measures, namely the vocabulary development. And at 8 months of age, we found no difference between the sample of infants in the COVID-19 study and the sample of infants in the pre-pandemic study. We found no difference in the measures for the comprehension or production vocabulary scores. However, we followed the infants from the COVID-19 segmentation study to examine their later vocabulary outcomes, and found that together with gains in vocabulary development with age, we found that the infants from the COVID-19 study have lower expressive vocabulary scores than same-age infants from the pre-pandemic CDI norming study at 12 months of age. And at 15 months of age, infants from the COVID-19 study scored lower both for receptive and expressive vocabulary scores than same-age infants from the pre-pandemic CDI norming study. So when we consider word segmentation abilities in this particular context, we see that segmentation abilities are delayed in typically developing infants. And we also see that their later vocabulary outcomes show lower vocabulary scores than same-age infants in a pre-pandemic context. Let me now move into the discussion section. And we go back to the fundamental question we asked: which prosodic patterns and cues are attended to in early development? The findings, I believe, have clearly shown that precocious perception abilities for prosody are language specific. So the cues or the sets of cues used to perceive stress and intonation, and that can be possibly used to develop early word segmentation abilities, seem to be crucially language dependent. This raises important questions to theories of language acquisition. How do infants know which prosodic cues are relevant and informative? This is, of course, a very big open question. And evidence so far suggests that they get the answer from just a few months of exposure to the ambient language, probably using general abilities like pattern detection, edge salience, or grouping biases. This is in the case, of course, of typical development, and they are using this to, of course, to develop their word segmentation abilities and their word learning abilities. However, atypically developing infants might need more exposure, especially in the cases there is a delay in development, or findings suggest a delay in development or suggest a different developmental route. We have seen that atypically developing infants might show, for them, stress perception might be more challenging. They might show delayed segmentation abilities and also delayed word learning abilities. And also, typically developing infants showed effects of altered exposure in the particular context of the COVID-19 pandemic, with delays in the development of word segmentation abilities and also in later vocabulary development. So these sets of findings on the perception of stress and intonation, and the ability to use stress and intonation cues to develop early word segmentation, and also the impact of early word segmentation abilities on the development of word learning and vocabulary development. So these sets of findings suggest that we need good accounts of language particular prosody, and we need to pay more attention to the specific prosodic cues of linguistic contrasts and categories, so that we may foster our understanding of language acquisition in typical and atypical development, as well as on the role of prosody in language learning and language impairment. And this has implications for remediation and intervention strategies to support language acquisition. I would like to acknowledge all my collaborators and express our gratitude to all the infants and their families. And I would like to thank you all for attending this talk. Muito obrigada, and I'm ready to take your questions and comments.
Thank you, Sónia, very much for this comprehensive talk. Such a rich talk with so much data and so many different findings. So I just would like to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, just put it into the chat, and I can read those questions for Sónia. And I see we already have a question, so I'm just gonna start with that. And the question comes from Gabriela Braga, and the question is, are there any other studies about the use of masks and language acquisition, perhaps acquisition of English or Dutch?
Yes, there are studies on English, mostly. There are studies on English mostly, so the studies are coming up, have been coming up in the last year. So in fact, we have many studies, and they are looking at the effects of masks in different domains. And in the specific case of word segmentation abilities that I know of, there is no other study looking at word segmentation abilities in another language, but there are studies looking at word recognition, looking at voice recognition, looking at consonant recognition or consonant discrimination. This with, of course, this with infants and toddlers. With older children, there are many studies in the classroom. So studies that have been examining the impact of masks in the classroom. But we, of course, what we have found in our study was that it was not just and only the face mask. So the effect that we found was beyond the face mask. So it seems that the fact that infants were born during the pandemic, they were living until very recently, right? They were living all their lives during the pandemic, and the changes that the pandemic brought, not only in the kinds of cues that were available, but also in the interactions, in the communication with other people. So, for example, in the nursery, the fact that masks were obligatory in the nursery, maybe people were not communicating in the same way because they were wearing a face mask. Or if infants were not in nurseries, they stay at home, but parents were working at the same time. So maybe parents were not interacting as much with infants as they did before. So we have a questionnaire, we ran a questionnaire on all these facts. And I think the effect goes beyond face masks, and it is still to be understood. And of course, we need to follow these infants to see when their language development is going to converge, because of course, we hope that it will at some point.
Thank you, Sonia, for the answer. And while we are waiting for other questions in the chat, I actually also had a question related to the COVID study that we just had a question about. So it is shocking that infants born during the pandemic, how they showed no segmentation effect. And the segmentation effect is a very well-established effect. So you would expect to replicate it, and it is shocking. And then my question is kind of related to what you just said previously, that to what degree do you think it is really related to wearing masks or just the lack of interactions, right? So it's not even just interacting differently, but because of the closures and everything, there was also just less time for infants and for young children to interact with their peers, to interact with other caregivers than their own family. And that could also affect the vocabulary development, because you also showed that the vocabulary development is different from other children as well. And then I just don't know if you collected any data to look at the amount of time they spent with interacting with others, or I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, so thank you, Monica. Yes, so we when the pandemic started, we were running a series of longitudinal studies, and so we thought we need to have a questionnaire. We need to have a questionnaire that addresses some of the issues, the new issues that we have now with this pandemic. So we started asking parents to answer that questionnaire. It was an in-lab questionnaire. And we asked about time of exposure of the infant to the mask. We asked about number of people that the infant was interacting with weekly, on a weekly basis. we asked about the infant being or not in a nursery. So because parents have to fill in so many questionnaires, we tried to keep it short. And now we are kind of sorry that we didn't introduce other questions in the questionnaire as well. But we are trying to, we are following these infants, so we are contacting the parents again, and we are trying to gather more information. So the results that we have show that the infants are interacting with people, so they are not, of course, isolated, but interactions are more limited. So that's what we have. In terms of time to mask exposure per day, on average, we have between 4 to 5 hours of mask exposure of the infants per day. But we still need to know more about the quantity and the quality of the interactions. And also another point that someone suggested to us after we published the study was trying to know whether parents had any issues related with depression or any of these features that were quite common during the pandemic, because there was struggle in many, because of work, because of being with the kids, because of the situation, because it is known that when there is depression, the interaction with the infants changes quite a lot. So that's something that we do not know, and we will try to gather the data. Yeah, but definitely, I think we need to know more. It has to be more than just a mask to have such a strong effect.
Yeah, these are great points, and I am very much looking forward to your future findings, because we need to understand more about this, because it has implications to typical language development as well, right? So what it is that we need for typical language development, and what context is the best for language learning. So this is great. I'm very excited. And in the meantime, we have another question in the chat. This is from Raquel Freitag. She says, great project. Thank you for sharing it with us. I just would like to share a result. We have launched a project about the effect of wearing a facial mask on the sound change. And results from a pilot study show that there are no differences between with mask and without mask conditions regarding palatalization and denasalization in spoken Brazilian Portuguese. Maybe there are other things that we can note, but we don't understand yet. So I don't know, Sonia, if you would like to comment on this finding, or?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I understand fully.
Sure.
The project.
So they looked at wearing a facial mask on the effect of sound change. And they have a pilot study that showed that there are no differences between with mask and without mask conditions.
Okay.
So I assume that maybe the person who was uttering the stimuli wore a mask or did not wear a mask.
Okay.
And they did palatalization and denasalization in spoken Brazilian Portuguese.
Okay. So sound change in the sense of like a Sandy phenomena.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Something like that. So how the sound change in a given context, and whether that the use of the mask might impact those effects of contextual changes in the sound. I don't know if the measures were acoustic or perceptive. Yeah, I'm not surprised that it comes out in the acoustics, because although we still have to understand better how the masks degrade the acoustic signal, and there are also papers coming on that. And this varies also with respect to the type of mask. That's very important. Masks are not all alike, right? In this respect. But what we found in our case, we found a kind of attenuation in the acoustic signal that was mostly felt in the intensity and F0. Okay, so, and this affects mostly prominence and everything that has to do with F0. And I think that those effects have, those kinds of sound changes are not prominence dependent, or are not related to F0, so they are related to other parameters that are possibly preserved.
Thank you, Sonia. And I have a other question in the chat. This is from Luciani Astertanani. The question is, what do these results suggest about the prosody perception process at large? What should we pay attention to in our research? Like, that's quite a big question.
Wow.
But maybe
Yes.
you can just start addressing it. So
Yes.
what do these results suggest about the prosody perception process at large, and what should we pay attention to in our research?
Mm-hmm. Well, I tried to give a hint at that in my take-home message, right? So I think that these results suggest that we really need to pay attention. First, we need to pay attention to prosody because it plays a relevant role in language acquisition, language development, in language processing in general. And when pay attention to prosody, I think we cannot, or we should not generalize. We should not transfer immediately the findings that we have from one language to another. In the language acquisition field, sometimes this happens, right? Because we think, okay, there is some general process going on, and we are looking at cues that are very salient. So what matters is the salience of the cues independently of the language we are considering, right? Independently of the ambient language, independent of the language the infant is exposed to. And I think that the more we study different languages, and in particular languages that have typological differences in terms of their prosodic profile, the more we study these languages, we understand that very, very early on in development, infants are sensitive to the differences across languages. And very especially, they are highly sensitive to the differences in their language or their languages. Okay, so I really think we need to pay attention to the differences between languages in prosody. So we really need studies for as many languages as possible. And these studies are fundamental for us to have a reference to study then language acquisition and development in different languages. And this is also crucial to have a better understanding of the language acquisition process, right? So I think we this is what I would say for now to that big question.
Yeah, and it was a great answer to this great and big question. And I just completely do agree with you, Sonia, that there should be a bit more attention on prosody, stress, pitch, and so on, because they are kind of low-level acoustic cues that infants at a very early age, they are very sensitive to, and they can use just to build their language on. And as you said throughout your talk, that these prosodic patterns, stress patterns, they correlate with word boundaries, they correlate with syntactic structures, so they can bootstrap a language acquisition in a given language. Now, my next question is, given my background, that might not surprise you, I am curious about bilingual infants. So because bilingual infants, they can be exposed to prosody and stress patterns that might be different in the two languages or maybe similar. So I am just curious if there is anything out there that we know about bilingual infants when it comes to prosody bootstrapping, language acquisition, and if there is any speculation on whether learning two languages that are similar in terms of their prosody or different in terms of their prosody would be easier to learn for, or not easier, yeah, maybe easier to learn for bilingual infants. So it's another big question for you.
Yes, another big question. So we know from a number of studies on stress perception, and I will use one or two examples to make it more concrete and easy to follow. So, but for example, in the case of let's say French and English bilinguals, or French and Dutch bilinguals, so we know that in the case of having these pairs of languages like French and English or French and Dutch that are prosodically very different with respect to stress. So bilingual infants exposed to these pairs of languages, they show a different development of stress perception than monolingual French infants, okay? Because monolingual French infants, they are not sensitive to the differences, the different stress patterns, especially in the presence of segmental variability. That is what is similar to the real language, right? But bilinguals, when they are French German or French English, they do it. Okay, so they already show that sensitivity to the different stress patterns. So they show a different development of stress perception, and that is because they are bilinguals of language pairs that are different in their prosody. Most of the studies I know of, they look at prosodic properties in bilinguals of languages that differ with respect to those prosodic properties. And I think the general finding is that these bilinguals differ from the monolinguals of the language that does not show a certain type of prosodic profile. So what I would say first is that the development is different. And it is especially different when we have these interesting pairs of languages. Is it more difficult or is it easier? I think that's a very hard question to answer. And I think it depends a lot on the features at stake and on the properties at stake. Yeah, for example, in this case, in the case of this example, we would say it looks easier, right? Because they are picking up the difference and they are getting the difference and they are already showing something that the monolinguals do not have. So for this, at least for this prosodic property, it seems to be relevant, and it seems not to be difficult at all. Yeah, but we cannot generalize again. We need to look at the different languages, and we need to look at the different properties, and yeah, and maybe we have some predictions and then we find some surprises. Yes, we need to do the work. We need to do the work.
Exactly. Just how you said that, oh, we cannot generalize, or we run studies in a couple of languages and then we cannot just generalize to all languages. And we unfortunately often see that in textbooks, right? So we have like some prosody studies run in English and then we generalize everything to all the other languages. And then, as you said, it would be probably great to see different bilingual language pairs and how prosody of the language pairs affect language acquisition. But in the meantime, we have 2 more questions in the chat. So one from Marina. Sonia, do you think that pandemic kids should undergo a remedy program? What kind of intervention might be useful? Is it still possible to intervene at a later stage?
Okay. Well, the findings that we had were surprising and were quite strong. It was a strong effect. So I think that these kids could, I wouldn't say an intervention program, but I think they could be exposed. I think people at nurseries or parents or families, I think this idea of increasing their exposure, of interacting with them, so simply doing that, I think it would be helpful. Of course, I don't have the data to prove that, so this is just a hunch. But that's what I would suggest. And in fact, at the lab, before we did the study, we had parents, and more than parents, we had educators saying, we seem to detect differences between our infants now and the infants that we had in previous years. And parents would say, it seems that my kid is going slower than his brother or sister. Okay, so and this is in line exactly with what we found. So that would be my advice, let's say.
Completely makes sense. Thank you, Sonia. And we have a other question from Yosue Jimenez. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. This presentation was very interesting. I was wondering if your team has worked on the link between prosody development and written language acquisition. Do these studies tell us something about it?
Well, no, my team has not worked on the link between prosodic development and written language acquisition. That's extremely interesting topic. Our work focused mostly in the first 2.5 years of life. And so we do not get to the age where we have written development going on. But I definitely think it is worth pursuing this line of research. And I would be very interested in collaborating, if possible, with people that would like to conduct this kind of work.
Thank you, Sonia. And while we are waiting for other questions in the chat, we still have a few minutes left. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask now. In the next few minutes, I have one more question, and that's related to the typically developing and Down syndrome kids. This is kind of the data that you presented at the beginning of your talk. And for instance, DS kids, they could not discriminate stress, but they were good with intonation, with the yes or no questions. So I'm just wondering, why do you think that is? So why do you think that they did better on one task or the other? And I have also kind of a methodology question, like, do you think it has something to do with processing stress versus intonation? Or could it be due to methodological differences? So maybe one methodology was more suitable than other for atypically developing kids.
Yeah. Thank you, Monica. Very good question. Well, I'll go to the methodological question later. I think that processing stress is more complex than processing intonation. And the reason for this is that stress involves processing a number of cues relative to each other, okay, and relative to each other in different segments of the word. Stress involves duration, right? Involves, at least in European Portuguese, so it involves duration, and in the stimuli, it involves computing duration together with the pitch contour. Okay, so these cues need to be integrated, and then we need to compare this integration across syllables. So I think the processing is more complex. In the case of intonation, we might just be following the pitch contour, okay, and understanding the shape of the pitch contour. So this is, in terms of processing, I think it is simpler. So yes, I would say there is a difference between intonation and stress per se. But you are right, the methodologies were different, right? So in the case of stress, we used a paradigm that in fact had been tried before in a number of studies without success. And for some reason, we could do it using anticipatory looking. And in the case of intonation, we used an old traditional paradigm, very similar to the switch thing. So then, of course, there are methodological differences. And the only way to know the right answer would be to run the stress discrimination study using the kind of paradigm that we used with intonation. And in fact, that is being done by a PhD student of mine. Okay, and we'll see.
Thank you, Sonia. And I'm sorry, in the meantime, this is the beauty of working from home. My husband just made an appearance. I'm sorry about that. I hope it was not distracting. And we have a other question from Jovana Pejovic. She is asking, related to my question, if stress was more difficult for AR and DS groups, should we develop interventions to improve exactly this aspect, or to focus on their strengths rather than weaknesses?
Yeah, well, I think the best would be to do both. So the best would be to try to use the strengths to use the strengths as a bootstrapping tool, basically, right? To get into the other aspects of language learning, that definitely. So we really need to find out what the strengths are for these atypical groups. I think that is really very, very important. But of course, we also need to know what the weaknesses are, right? Because we need to try to find strategies to turn the weaknesses into, if not into strengths, into something that develops, right? So I think we need to do both. And in fact, I think we can use intonation to work on stress. Okay, because at least one of the cues for stress is pitch, is the pitch movement in the stress syllable. If we use single words, and of course with atypically developing kids, we need to use simple stimuli, right? So if we use single words, we can use the pitch cue to try to develop stress perception. So that would be the way to go, I would say.
Great question and a great answer. And we only have a couple of minutes left. So this is the last call for questions. Maybe someone would like to ask something, but in the meantime, I just want to start saying thank you, Sonia, for this wonderful talk today and for the exciting discussion section. I feel like I learned a lot, and I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to moderate this talk. And I don't think there are any other questions for today, which is fine because we had so many great questions. And I just also wanted to thank the audience for attending and everyone for being here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Monica, also for moderating this talk. And muito obrigada à Abralin, mais uma vez, por esta excelente iniciativa de ter mais uma conversa, mais uma palestra. Espero que a Abralin ao vivo continue por muito, muito tempo. É uma excelente iniciativa. Muito obrigada por me terem convidado a estar aqui. Muito obrigada, Maria Cristina. Muito obrigada a toda a audiência.
Muito obrigada a você, Sônia. Ouvir você é sempre muito bom, muito instrutivo. A gente te agradece muito. A Abralin agradece também a Mônica Molnar pela participação dela, e a gente agradece a todo mundo que veio prestigiar essa fala. A gente espera que a Abralin ao vivo continue e que você também venha prestigiar novamente a gente aqui, Sônia. Muito obrigada pela sua fala.